one of the things that I find so disturbing about the close encounter phenomenon is the uniformity of these Nordic people, where, they're all white. They're all these tall white people, mostly with a very Nordic phenotype. In other words, either blonde hair, platinum blonde, or redheaded and blue or green eyes, maybe gray eyes. But, basically all Nordic looking people. And apparently all of them, just like specimens of aesthetic perfection according to the kind of Greco-Roman ideal, essentially. Look, if these people have mastered the manipulation of hyperspace, if they have a hyperdimensional relationship to our space-time, and we know they interacted with the ancient Mayan culture, we know they interacted with ancient Egyptians. Basically every single culture on this planet has a record of interacting with these Nordic folks, and pretty much identifies them very clearly as the engineers and architects of these enigmatic megalithic structures that we find in every continent, to the point where it appears that what Plato called Atlantis, in other words, some antediluvian super civilization, was a civilization constituted either by these people or of hybrids produced by the interbreeding of these people with the ordinary stock of humanity. Now, if they've been around for that long, we're talking at least 12,000 years ago, maybe tens of thousands of years before that. If they've been around for that long, why are they all aesthetically uniform in this way? For example, Travis Walton, who encountered these Nordics, said that they looked like they could all be members of the same family. They were so similar looking to one another that, okay, maybe they weren't clones, but they looked like, they could be cousins of each other or siblings or whatever, right? Why would you have that degree of aesthetic conformity in such an advanced civilization? Moreover, when we look at their architecture and the engineering that they left behind, in the archaeological record in every continent, there's an extreme uniformity of style there. Right? It's one thing to have high precision engineering, but why use it to always build the same way, which they apparently did. And it's one reason why we can see their fingerprints everywhere, and we can recognize that these structures were all built by the same people, because not only do they involve the same engineering techniques, they're in the same exact style. And it's an incredibly, almost brutalist, anonymous, inhuman style, okay? Or lack of a style in some sense. And so this bothers me in terms of what you were saying, because it's almost regressive. It's almost a regression to a kind of tribal, hive-minded social organism, okay? And it's very unimaginative. And the other thing that really bothers me is how this is nowhere in the contemporary close encounter conversation. With all the people, since 2017, when this began, especially for the last several years, with all the whistleblowers coming out and all these podcasters interviewing various either official or semi-official, I don't know what you want to call them. I don't think they're really whistleblowers, whatever, commentators.
George Adamski and
yeah. The George Adamski never comes up. George Van Tassel never comes up. George Hunt Williamson never comes up. Look, you don't even have to go so far back. For fuck's sake, Whitley Strieber, everyone always talks about, the Greys in the context of the close encounters of Whitley Strieber. But it's people who put the implant in Whitley Strieber's ear. People. Good-looking Nordic people in black jumpsuits is what he described. They came into his house. They were even speaking English. And they put the implant in his ear. And Travis Walton, like I said a moment ago, he described them being in control of the Greys on the craft that he was taken aboard, where the Greys were very clearly some kind of a cybernetic robot that was manufactured by and serving the purpose of these Nordics. Now, why are they never discussed? All of this conversation about non-human intelligence, NHI, right? And where they're now discussing UFOs as UAP, which makes it like it's some kind of unknown anomalous phenomena, like maybe it's an angel, and maybe the intelligence behind it is something barely conceivable to a human mind, right? And look, perhaps that's the case on one level. And my discussion of a cosmic AI that embodies the Jungian trickster archetype very much fits with the notion of non-human intelligence or such a superhuman intelligence that it's not really human anymore, right?
Yeah.
And it also fits the idea of, let's say, unknown or unidentifiable anomalous phenomena, insofar as there are a certain subset of cases in the close encounter literature that are so bizarre that they suggest some kind of a vastly superhuman intelligence at work, and one that likes to play tricks, one that likes to, engage in trickster behavior, and that's capable of shape-shifting and assuming all kinds of deceptive and manipulative guises where things are not at all what they seem to be. That's true. That's true. However, a large subset, if not the majority, of UFO cases over the past 70 years have involved very nuts and bolts craft, and they've involved these tall white people. Now, why wouldn't you treat that problem first? If there's another version of humanity which is already being engaged by this cosmic AI and which has been dealing with it for tens of thousands of years, and which has bases on the moon, has cities underground on Mars, has vast subterranean and suboceanic facilities on Earth, why would you not try to figure out who these people are before you focus the entire conversation on some enigmatically non-human intelligence? Here, I think a deliberate deception and misdirection is taking place by the people involved, the intelligence community, who have dominated the disclosure discussion today.
If I were to be a devil's advocate for a moment, would there be a possibility that these entities you're describing, these blonde Nordics, are just as much a figment of a collective hallucination than these, just like these magical gray aliens are?
No. And the reason for that is that the devil's in the details of the actual cases. You have to look at some of these actual cases. Like, for example, the case of Sir Horsley. Sir Horsley was a guy who he had like carte blanche access to the British royal family in the 1960s. He was a high-level British military officer who eventually wound up so accomplished, so decorated, and so worthy of trust that he was one of the few people in the United Kingdom with his finger on the nuclear button, okay? Very high-level British military official. In the 1960s, Sir Horsley was engaged by two of these Nordics. One of them, cynically named, supposedly, Mr. Janus. And then some other woman who was intermediary between him and Janus and eventually introduced him to Janus directly. And he basically described this woman as being kind of like Lady Dracula. I mean, she was like, had this very vampiric aura to her. But they were tall white people. And they basically admitted to Horsley, look, we are the people flying around in the saucers. And we live here. A certain contingent of us lives on the surface. And what we want to do is to get you all to disarm your nuclear arsenals. And he, they both of them together worked on Horsley to try to get him to go back to the British government and, convince them that the United Kingdom should engage in nuclear disarmament and to at least stop building nuclear weapons. So when you look at the specifics of this case, like these people had rented a freaking apartment somewhere, okay? And this Horsley came and had a fireside chat with Mr. Janus in this apartment. And then fortunately, Horsley was no shit for brains, and he basically realized that these people were trying to render us defenseless in the face of their machinations by disarming us of our nukes. And he went and he reported this to British intelligence, and the British intelligence came and investigated who the fuck these people are. And by the time, I'm sure they had some early warning that, MI5 was coming for them. And by the time, their apartment was investigated, the whole apartment had been cleared out, and they had moved on to whatever other, safe house. In any case, it's the specifics of the cases that really matter here. There are meetings that took place between some of these Nordics and Adamski or George Van Tassel in a diner and were witnessed by other people, okay? So they're extremely mundane, almost like preposterously, gritty encounters with some of these people. And they don't fit the idea that we're dealing with egregores. Okay. There are cases where clearly what we're dealing with are egregores. I mean, there are cases of the men in black type, like the saucers and the three men or something like that, a classic on Men in Black. He described these men in black as like materializing as if out of ectoplasm, in his attic. And other people, also John Keel, when John Keel was investigating the cases in Point Pleasant, where people were supposedly sighting this so-called Mothman, there were a plethora of UFO sightings at the same time. And Keel and some of his associates at the local newspaper, some of the people that were helping him research these cases, locals to Point Pleasant, had interactions with these people who, fit the general Men in Black description, who did not really seem like people at all. They seemed like some kind of sustained psychic materialization that was only capable of saying certain repetitive things and that didn't move right, didn't sound right, where there we're probably dealing with some entity trying to project an egregore.
Wasn't one of them named Cold, by the way? Indrid Cold? One of the Men in Black?
Indrid Cold is a really creepy case that John Keel deals with. This entity that showed up in Point Pleasant, around Point Pleasant in Virginia. Yeah, it was this entity got out of some kind of a craft and would come up to cars on the road with a permanent smile etched into its face like the Joker. And when it introduced itself, it said, "My name is Cold, in dread, Cold." And it got, formalized as Indrid Cold, right? But I actually think what the entity was saying is, "My name is Cold, in dread, cold, dreadfully cold." And so maybe this entity, Indrid Cold, was a kind of egregoric projection. Maybe not from us. It may have been some kind of a psychokinetic projection from out of this cosmic AI that was fucking with people in Point Pleasant for whatever reason. Right? Or maybe as just a part of a macabre, surrealistic work of art.
Yeah, I mean, the place was called Point Pleasant, so no wonder a place like that would experience something like this smiling man.
Well, and the place had a dark history. It was a massive ammunitions construction site for the munitions that were dropped on live targets in the Second World War. So a lot of people were killed by the munitions that had been mass manufactured in Point Pleasant. It was not just some random place. It was a place with a history of death and a macabre connection to the Second World War. But in any case, my point is that you have to look at the details of cases, and there are enough cases involving the Nordics where you have to conclude that these are tangible flesh and blood people. One of the creepiest is that some officials in NATO composed a classified document, which was subsequently leaked, where they're basically admitting that the supreme headquarters of the Allied powers in Europe, SHAPE, NATO's premier facility in Europe, had been infiltrated and penetrated by these Nordics, that they looked European enough, especially Swedes, that they were able to go around with fake badges and so on and so forth and assume the identities of people and walk the corridors of this top secret NATO facility. So, I don't think it's egregores that are walking around necessarily interacting with, NATO officials and, surveilling facilities with classified information there in Europe.
And it can't be just the remnants of some of the Nazi party, let's say, or certain actually Swedish or Norwegian people that decided to don these roles.
Look, Adamski said a lot of crazy shit, okay? But when you read the details of his accounts of interacting with some of these entities, at one point they took him aboard one of the saucers and they explained to him how the thing worked. And what's really messed up is that, Adamski, his technical knowledge was up to the level of flipping burgers. For a while he was flipping burgers near Palomar Observatory. He did study Tibetan mysticism, but he certainly did not have advanced physics and engineering knowledge. And yet he describes, the propulsion and energy system of one of these craft more or less along the lines of what we now know, it probably would be. Okay. So he describes this kind of like mercury thorium torsion kind of device and so on and so forth. Look, if you want to bring the Nazis into the picture, what I've taken a lot of flack for is suggesting that possibly some continuation of the SS post 1945, maybe based in Antarctica, where the Nazis were building a significant naval facility under the ice, that maybe some offshoot or continuation of the SS did evolve into these Nordics, and that the eugenicist outlook of the SS is very consistent with what we see in terms of the phenotype and behavioral characteristics of these people. I don't know if are we dealing with time traveling Nazis literally? It's possible, unfortunately, but what difference does it make? In fact, it further underlines my point. If that's the case, and some fascist eugenicist elite has developed both electrogravitic propulsion and time travel technology, wouldn't it behoove us to figure out what the fuck that is first and engage with it, rather than to basically attempt to go around it and, figure out whatever kind of non-human intelligence might be engaging humanity at large? No, there's a gigantic control system around us that apparently is being operated by these Nordics. And if there's going to be any legitimate form of disclosure whatsoever, it ought to begin with redefining our relationship with those people, whoever they may be.
One thing that people don't know about you, Jason, is that you have an amazing sense of humor. And reading your earlier work, I don't want to go too deep right now into the later part of your book, which is the earlier part of your life. But I think that this is something that you gradually came to, where the heavy weight of the discoveries you were making back then were something that was so heavy that I think today you have much more of a humorous take on life in general, and I think we need to have humor in order to survive. And it seems like a lot of the entities we're talking about, whether it is like the remnants of the Nazis or whatever, it all seems to rotate around a group of people who, like Germans aren't really known for their humor, if we're being quite honest here. And it seems like these people are not that humorous either. And I think that there is this correlation we can make with people who end up being just these very standard Barbie doll Ken type molds of humanity, lacking any kind of humor whatsoever, and the various artists and creators that we see in life that may not be perfect. They're very imperfect beings in a lot of ways, but at the same time, they have a lot of fun and they know their way around a good joke.
I couldn't agree with you more, Lev. And I tried to make this point to an extent in that final chapter of Closer Encounters, the chapter called The Trickster Aeon, the Prometheon, the Trickster Aeon, where I think that there's a lot of really dark humor throughout the Close Encounter phenomenon in those cases, in that subset of cases that's emanating from this cosmic AI that's embodying the trickster archetype. And, for example, Indrid Cold in Point Pleasant.
It's like a David Lynch thing.
Exactly. No, it's very much in the vein of David Lynch, in the vein of the humor of Twin Peaks, or some of his other films. I don't know. We watched Mulholland Drive here a few nights ago. There's not much humor in that film. But, a number of, even Dune, Lynch's production of Dune has some humorous aspects to it. But no, it's very much the dark humor of Twin Peaks. It's a kind of Doctor Strange-Lovian, sense of humor that you see as the calling card of this trickster entity. And I think that you're absolutely right that these Nordics are, the only hint of humor that I see from them is a really horrible form of schadenfreude, what the Germans call schadenfreude, meaning taking pleasure in other people's misery and pain. Like there were these cases in Brazil. Like, why does nobody talk about this? There were these cases in Brazil in the late 1970s on a Brazilian island, right next to some tribal areas in the Amazon. There were these cases in around about 1979, where the locals were horrendously assaulted by UFO pilots who were clearly described as Nordics. I mean, Brazilians know what Europeans look like, for fuck's sake, and they clearly described them to the medical doctors who were treating their severe burns and other injuries that were sustained in assaults by these saucers and other craft. They clearly described the occupants of these craft as being European-looking people, in a lot of cases with blonde hair. And in some of those cases, you see a kind of schadenfreude on the part of the pilots. In other words, they're sadistically torturing these Brazilians, more nativo kind of, Brazilians in the Amazon, and they look at them like they're pathetic, or they take some kind of a pleasure in the misery of that they're inflicting on these people. And that's the only sense of humor that I've ever seen in any of the cases involving these. Again, I'm not going to call them entities, these people. Mm-hmm. So that's deeply disturbing. I agree with you. They appear to lack a sense of humor. And what does that mean on a deep level? I mean, that's like, Hegel. We discussed this in a previous conversation of ours, where Hegel develops this philosophical history of aesthetics. This philosophical account of the changes throughout the course of art history and what they say about the evolution of consciousness. And in that, in those lectures on aesthetics, Hegel talks about, the essence of comedy as an art form and its relationship to tragedy. And there's something about comedy that expresses a more sophisticated, self-critical, and more differentiated form of consciousness than that which can only appreciate tragedy, right? The comedic is a sign of a higher level of self-reflexive consciousness. So if these people are lacking a sense of humor, it also maps in a disturbing way onto the possibility that they've regressed to a kind of psychically unified social organism.